Well, Jonas Brodin is going to be out for a while, a blow that the Wild absolutely will not be able to replace. We'll talk about that as well as a preview of tonight's game against the Seattle Kraken, all on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duham, and this is Locked on Wild.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we'll discuss the ramifications of Jonas Brodin's injury, as it sounds as though he is going to be out for a considerable amount of time after getting injured against the Edmonton Oilers. We'll look at how the Wilds will look to fill his spot in the lineup, and some of the things that are going to have to happen to try to fill a gaping void defensively for the Wild. We'll also take a look at tonight's game against the Seattle Kraken, who have lost 7 straight. And so an opportunity for the Wild to get back into the win column here this evening. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. And let's start with the bad news. Jonas Brodin, he's going to be out for a while. Left the game against the Oilers after getting hit into the boards by Evander Kane. And it does not sound good. John Hines, after the game, did not have any sort of indication or update as to his status. But as we've learned since, the team is going to be, he's considered week to week, although this is going to be a long-term injured reserve situation. Because as Michael Russo noted when asked about it, he tweeted out the sense that Brodin's going to be out for a while. And somebody responded and said, you know, with the fact that the Wilds have a handful of off days coming here between now and the end of the year, are they trying to kind of navigate through it to maybe not have to put Brodin on injured reserve? And Russo point blank said no, he's going to be put on long-term injured reserve once he misses the requisites for games. And I saw an update thrown out on Twitter that the expectation is that it'll be right around the 4-week mark. It's a terrible blow for this Minnesota Wild team, because Brodin is one of not only your best defensemen, but he's one of your most important defensemen. And the pairing of him and Brock Faber had been one of the better defensive pairings in the league in the amount of time that they have played together so far this season. Brodin is just a huge part of the penalty kill. He is one of your better defensemen from a coverage standpoint. He does a lot of things that you just can't replace by plugging somebody into the lineup, and further underscored by the options that the Wild have to be able to fill this type of void. Now, it is problematic because during this same time, you've also had Zach Bogosian, who's been injured for the last few games. And it sounds as though his status is still day-to-day, but there was some hope that maybe he'd be able to get into the lineup here, if not tonight, then coming up on Thursday. But this means that until Bogosian is able to get back into the lineup, that you're going to get both Alex Goligoski and John Merrill in to fill one of those spots. Now, what we saw in practice, it's not going to be those two together. And so here are a couple of things to consider with the state of the Wild decor right now. Number one, the fact that Brodin is going to be out for a considerable amount of time, I think likely means that Dakota Mermis is going to be sticking around to fill a spot. At least, obviously, he came with on the road trip, and so he will, he'll slot into the lineup against Seattle. My understanding or my expectation is that he will take Brodin's spot on the roster as long as Brodin is out. Now, the Wild at this point pretty healthy from a forward perspective. And so again, same story with how long-term injured reserve works is that the Wild then have the ability to go above the cap to fill Brodin's a portion of Brodin's salary as long as he's on long-term injured reserve. But the Wild, I think, will just play this like they did when Jared Spurgeon was put on earlier. Now, that was retroactive. And then with Alex Goligoski as well. They're just going to use this to be able to freely call players up without having to really crunch. And so it's going to be Mermis, I think, that will fill that spot. But don't be surprised if there are other injuries or other players that get dinged up. Don't be surprised if we see Damon Hunt get an opportunity to come back up. He looked good when he filled in earlier this season. But the thing that I worry about most here in this situation is how the responsibilities will be spread with Brodin out of the lineup. The line pairings for the Wild in practice featured Goligoski and Spurgeon, Middleton and Faber, and then Mermis and Merrill. But I think if Bogosian's ready to go, I think he will go with Mermis into the lineup, and then you can kind of pick and choose, I guess, which one you want to throw in. But the Wild trying to kind of hide a player like Goligoski with Spurgeon, it's going to be tricky to maneuver, and it's not going to be easy for this Minnesota Wild team. And so in Brodin's absence, the Wild are going to need to up their scoring, to bump the scoring up, to take pressure off of now a depleted decor, so that you're not having to rely on the likes of Alex Goligoski and John Merrill in the lineup on almost a nightly basis. You're going to have to try to maintain the zone and to put some pucks in the net, because you go up against the likes of, the Wild have some teams coming up that are fantastic offensively. So now it shifts to you're going to have to try to keep pace there, as opposed to trying to limit what your opponent is doing with Brodin out of the lineup. And Brodin was playing some of his best hockey of the season since John Hines took over. It's a huge loss, and it's not one that they're going to be able to replicate, to fix, to cover up. You're going to have guys like Spurgeon, like Middleton, like Faber. They're going to have to step up their game and just take the lead from this Wild decor, because you've got a guy like Bogosian, who is a clear third pairing defenseman. You've got now Goligoski, who's going to have to likely slot in to Brodin's roster spot. So you've got, at this point, you've got three capable defenders. You have a fourth in Mermis who does well enough to not really hurt you. But now you've got those two other guys in the lineup that you're going to have to just try to find a way to mask them so that they don't lead to opportunities for the opponent to just kind of take control and take over games. So there's a lot of maneuvering that's going to have to happen with Brodin out of the lineup. And the biggest impact is going to be on the penalty kill. Now you're going to have to really rely on probably Spurgeon, Middleton, Faber, and at this point, I'd probably go Mermis as your 4 penalty killing defenseman, most predominantly, because Brodin's probably your top penalty killing defenseman in addition to just all the other things that he does. So that's hugely deflating. Thank goodness the NHL gave Evander Kane a warning for that, to make sure that he doesn't do again what he's already done a bunch throughout his career. So thank you, Department of Player Safety, for that. And hurry back, Jonas Brodin, because we're going to sorely miss you. So that's kind of a deflating way to start what should be a winnable game for the Minnesota Wild here tonight, because turns out the Seattle Kraken are in free fall and they're dealing with injuries of their own. So we will discuss the Seattle Kraken, tonight's opponents, as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. Visit eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you join us after the game for another Locked on Wild postcast, hopefully after a Minnesota Wild win. Time will tell if the Wild can snap a 2-game losing streak against the Seattle Kraken and just continue to trend in the wrong direction. So let's talk about the Kraken a little bit here. And made news earlier today, in fact, by placing goalie Philip Grubauer on injured reserve. Grubauer was injured in last night's loss to the Tampa Bay Lightning. And also injured in the game was Justin Schultz, one of the Kraken's defensemen. To fill the roster space, Seattle has recalled goalie Chris Dreiger and defenseman Jacob Megna from the AHL. And so it looks as though, hasn't been confirmed yet by Daily Faceoff, but I would imagine it looks like Joey Decord is going to be the starter for the Kraken. Philip Gustafsson confirmed as the starter for the Minnesota Wild, but it is a Kraken team that currently is 8-13-7 heading into tonight's matchup. And for the Kraken, they have lost 7 games in a row. They are 0-5-2 in that span. They have had a couple of games that they got to overtime. And looking at this stretch, it started against Vancouver back on the 24th. They lost 5-1 to Vancouver. They lost 4-3 to Chicago. Then a 4-3 shootout loss to Toronto. 2-0 loss to Ottawa. 4-2 loss to Montreal. 2-1 loss to New Jersey. And a 4-3 overtime loss to the Lightning. Now, looking at the statistics for the Seattle Kraken, they come in having scored 73 goals in 28 games so far this season. But they just aren't having those takeover type years that we've seen from some of their key players, such as last year, which allowed them to climb up towards the top of the Pacific Division standings and get into the postseason and actually come away with a win in round 1 against the Colorado Avalanche. Special teams wise, the Kraken come in. They have a power play of 21.1%. Their penalty kill is at 76.3. And ironically enough, with all of the success that the Minnesota Wild have had, they're actually over 70% now on the season. Still dead last, but the San Jose Sharks are trying to give them a run for their money. So comparable special teams, but it is a Seattle team that just has not been able to score goals hardly at all. They're fourth worst in the NHL at 2.61 goals per game. And some of the leaders for the Kraken in the goals department, in fact, just one player, Jared McCann, with double-digit goals. He's got 13, has 18 points in 28 games, 13 goals, 5 assists. The Kraken have two players with 8 goals, Jaden Schwartz and Oliver Bjorkstrand. And after that, it's Eli Tolvanen with 6, Ty Cart with 5, and then Vince Dunn, Matty Beniers, and Yanni Gourde all have 4 goals apiece. And for Beniers, just 13 points in 28 games so far this season. He is a minus 19 on the season. So a rough start to the season, to say the least, for Matty Beniers. Had just a fantastic season last year for the Kraken. And you look at even translating that recently. Beniers has not scored a goal since the 28th and has just 1 point in his last 5 games. That was an assist against Montreal, a 4-2 loss for the Seattle Kraken. So from a points perspective, not a ton in the way of goal producers for this Kraken team. And you look at Joey Daccord, 3, 4, and 6 as a goaltender for the Kraken this season, with a 2.99 goals against average and an .894 save percentage. Collectively, the Kraken have a 339 goals against average and an 889 save percentage on the season. And so it's a goalie situation that you have to attack. You can't let substandard goalie situations off the hook by not being able to get into the offensive zone and by being too selective with the shots that you take. So it's the opportunities for the Minnesota Wild tonight are going to be there. And hopefully they are able to take advantage of that, because now, having lost 2 games in a row, you want to try to pick this game up so that you can get a split on the road trip and can start to try to get back into the Central Division standings. I mean, at this point, the Wild have the second fewest points in the Central. They're tied with Chicago for fewest wins in the Central, although the Wild do have a couple of games in hand on just about everybody in the division. But they have the 4th fewest points, trailing the Seattle Kraken by 1. And the Wild have 3 games in hand on the Seattle Kraken. So opportunity for Minnesota to bounce back after, honestly, I thought the effort by and large after the first period was good for the Wild against the Oilers. Just came down to a couple of things that led to the loss. So hopefully get off to a better start here in this one, having now had an opportunity to rest, and we'll see what happens. We'll take a look at the keys to the game here tonight, while also taking a look at a new look lineup for the Wild. We'll talk about all that as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. A new NHL season brings all sorts of possibilities, whether it be Marco Rossi scoring a couple of goals or the Minnesota Wild eventually down the line hoisting the Stanley Cup. And you can win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially daily fantasy hockey. Because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether elite players like Connor McDavid, Alex Ovechkin, Sidney Crosby, or Nathan McKinnon, will record more or less than their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, and more in a given game. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, make sure to join us after the game for another Locked On Wild postcast, hopefully recapping another win for the Minnesota Wild. But we will see how everything goes in this one tonight as the Wild try to get back into the win column. Taking a look at a few key things to look at in tonight's game. Let's talk about the line combinations. Some interesting tweaks for the Wild in this game here tonight. And it's not necessarily what you would think the Wilds are doing. If I told you that the top six has received a little bit of a shuffle for the Minnesota Wild here tonight. No, we did not see Ryan Hartman get bumped back up. The Wild used these combinations at practice today. Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Matt Boldy, your top line. Marcus Johansson, Marco Rossi, and Matt Zuccarello. Marcus Foligno, Freddie Gaudreau, and Pat Maroon. And Brandon Duhaime, Connor Dewar, and Ryan Hartman. Interesting to me because let's look at this. That Kaprizov, Rossi, Zuccarello combination has been a little quiet over the last couple of games. Joel Eriksson Ek and Matt Boldy have been scorching warm for the last few games themselves. And this has led to some questions as to why Marcus Johansson has been the third portion of that line. And again, from what I have been told, he's been playing better, but I just would like to see some point production from that third player on that line. And so now we get an opportunity to see if Kirill Kaprizov can light it up with Eriksson Ek and Boldy. It keeps Marco Rossi in the top six because, again, he has been consistently one of your better players so far this season. And so he still gets an opportunity to be paired with Matt Zuccarello. And maybe this will be the opportunity to get Marcus Johansson going, is not playing with Boldy and Eriksson Ek. I feel like this may be one of those kind of last chance situations for Marcus Johansson, where he's getting an opportunity here in the top six. If it doesn't work out for him, you can only put him in that spot for so long and just not have the stable production from that spot in the lineup. And Ryan Hartman looked better with Duhaime and Dewar. So if he doesn't end up being a top line guy, it seems like there is a fit on that second line for somebody from the bottom six. And I don't think you're not going to be in a scenario, and it doesn't seem like John Hines has tried to force this, which is great. You're not going to be trying to push Freddie Gaudreau into the top six. Hines just, he has been perfectly fine with Gaudreau being a bottom six guy where he should be. So he's not going to be one that hops up. Marcus Foligno's game does not fit what you're trying to do with your top six. Pat Maroon was a stopgap measure there early on in the season. And it just seems like Johansson is running out of rope. And if he doesn't figure it out, that he'll probably end up being a bottom six guy and will likely combine his speed with Connor Dewar and Brandon Duhaime until he can get it figured out. So it feels to me like at some point there's going to be a decision made there to pull him out of that top six. And so hopefully he can get it figured out, get a goal or four, get just some type of scoring, because this team needs consistent production from those top two lines. And if you have players that aren't providing it, then you should look for other opportunities within the roster to make it happen. So let's talk about keys to the game for tonight's matchup against the Seattle Kraken. And I'll start with number one is hot start. And I'm not trying to be cliche and basic with these, but let's get back to how this team looked at the start of the game against Vancouver as opposed to what happened against Edmonton. And yes, it was the second night of a back-to-back. That's a tricky situation for the team that is playing on the back-to-back going up against a team that's fully rested. So take advantage of that opportunity that the Kraken now are in that position here tonight. Take advantage of that opportunity and put them on their heels at home and try to get off to a good start. Maybe get a goal. The goalie situation a little unsettled now for the Kraken. Just put this game away early on. It's a Seattle Kraken team that struggles to score. And so if you can get 1 or 2 goals in the first period, that's going to put them really behind the 8 ball, as opposed to if you kind of play down to their level and you get stuck in a tight battle where they say, hey, if we get 1, we feel really good about where we're at, that we can come away with a win. So hot start is the first key. For the second key, with Brodin out of the lineup, let's see a guy like Jake Middleton step up and perform well. He's been better since Jared Spurgeon got back into the lineup, but now obviously those two have been split up to try to evenly spread the D pairings a little bit. Let's see a strong game from Jake Middleton to kind of help fill some of that void left by Brodin being out of the lineup. You know what you're going to get from Brock Faber. You know what you're going to get from Jared Spurgeon. You know what you're going to get from Dakota Mermis. Let's see Middleton up his game a little bit and help fill some of that absence with Brodin out of the lineup. And the third key, on the topic of Jonas Brodin, we got to find a better way. We got to find the ability to limit some of those more careless types of penalties. And again, we talked in the postcast about the roughing call that Ryan Hartman received after Evander Kane knocked Jonas Brodin out of the game. But more so the penalty holding onto the stick that Matt Zuccarello got early on in the game. Like, you're probably not going to get through an entire game without being called for a penalty. But now with this penalty kill without Jonas Brodin, let's not try to overwork them against a Seattle Kraken team that's decent on the power play. But again, they keep it 5-on-5 where they struggle. And if the Wild do that, if they get timely goals here or there, Philip Gustafsson continues the role that he's been on, this should be a win. And so I like to finish these pregame episodes with just some of the things that I will be watching here in tonight's game. First and foremost is the D pairings, to see if the spread it out approach for John Hynes works, if that leads to more consistent D coverage as opposed to like going all in on your top 2 pairings and just kind of leaving the rest up to chance. So that will be the first thing that I'm keeping an eye on here tonight. Second thing will be the new top line combination. Let's see Kaprizov and Matt Boldy go nuts and take over tonight's game and put Seattle in a bad spot right off the bat. And Joel Eriksson no slouch either, leading the team in goals. Let's see what that combination can do against this Kraken team. And then the final thing is always the goalie, Philip Gustafsson. Let's see how Gustafsson does against a team that is not playing well. Let's see if he can be airtight in this one and not give Seattle any goals or any opportunities to get some momentum. Let's see him suck the life out of Climate Pledge Arena and not make it difficult for the Wild in this game. It really shouldn't be, especially with Seattle playing last night. The Wild should come out just ready to rock from the get-go and try to pick up a win here that they don't have to really sweat before heading home for Thursday's game against Calgary. That would be superly appreciated. But as always, we'll see what happens. And that will do it for today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you join us after the game tonight for Locked on Wild postcast. We'll break down all the action, the highs, the lows, and then we've got a Monday episode for you too, with Alex Micheletti breaking down all the action as well. So make sure that you subscribe to Locked on Wild and follow us throughout the rest of the season. We have new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.